Thank you very much, Winnie. Thanks, Thomas, for the invitation. I am extremely pleased to be here, and I have to say that the topic of the entire conference is surprisingly intersecting with my research in ways that are exhilarating. So I will share my screen in a few moments. Just before I do that, in my presentation, I will show videos that have pictures and that have sound. So there are two things to be aware. The one that you may want to enable original sound on your computer, and the other is that my internet connection has a central error, which the technicians will remediate tomorrow. If I'm cutting out, I am deeply sorry. And I'm hoping that it won't happen. Conducting as a multisensory instrument. Can you... I will share this screen. Can we see the screen? Wonderful. And very well. Before I start with some deep meaning exploration of the topic, I would like to show two videos that show two almost ridiculous employments of the conducting or the conductor. These conductings were considered not very long ago, even 20 years ago, highly skilled, acceptable, and even inspirational conducting styles. Today, we see them radically differently. And my research question is, what do we see them as? How do their perception intersect with new tendencies where we actually ask conductors to act in this way and to move their hands in a way that were considered not long ago artistically acceptable? Let us start with one of the staples of the historic repertoire, Beethoven Fifth. Do we know when to play? This is the question. Sorry. This is the first example. The second example is Hungarian dance number 6 with a conventional orchestra performance. However, we see a performance from the conductor accompanied by the orchestra. In reflection to these two videos, there is one common element that with both conductings, the orchestra knows how to play together, and they learned how to relate to this conducting. It also amplifies the question that emerges at the beginning of the 21st century. What is conducting? Is it still the same métier that has been in the 19th century? And if it transitioned to something else, what is that? And while I don't have the answer, my research includes one important component that includes the visual culture in relation to the conducting. I am starting my research from the point of view where we consider the visual culture as a transformational element in conducting, where conducting begins to act as a visual instrument rather than a soundless acoustical instrument. For a long time, the talk and the analysis of conducting has been a taboo because of the status of conductors and because of the power positions that are involved in this discourse. Today, it is not anymore so. And there are multiple ways of employing conducting without employing the power position of the conductor. And I will review a couple of the settings and the compositions that are cornerstones of this approach today. And I hope that I can give you a couple of interesting starting points to think about that. And I'm hoping to have an interesting and stimulating conversation about that. Transmodal signal flow is a concept that has been coined by the gesture research, spearheaded by Adam Candon. In transmodal signal flow, the impulse is starting in one of the modalities. Let's say we have a visual impulse, and it jumps through several sensory channels until it arrives to another modal channel, such as movement or such as sweating, olfactory channel, and so on. Conducting is the trigger of such a transmodal signal flow. Even more, it is the transmodal instrument. The impulse is starting from an acoustical standpoint, the impression of the composer who has composed and deduced their acoustical impressions into a coded form, the score, and this acoustic impulse is translated into movements, which triggers again kinetic impulses from the musicians that produce sound. It employs a mechanism, and it comes with the question, what is the structure and the role in the signal chain of the conducting gestures? If we compose 4 conductors, and we have countless examples for that, how does that relate to the traditional concept of the conductor, and what are the new ways that it shows us? I have a couple of personal interests in this research. I have composed myself compositions that employ performers who are only moving, so visual instruments employed in the middle of the orchestra. And I participated in several performances that focus on the conducting movements as stage objects. Just recently I performed several times Alexander Schubert's composition Serious Smile that I will show later. This is a composition that requires the conductor to trigger electronic sensors with the conducting movements. I have an example to show the difference between the conducting movements as perceived musically and as perceived visually. I'm showing now two renderings of the Stravinsky Le Sacre du Printemps. One will be a very familiar recording with Bernstein and the London Symphony Orchestra. And the pair of this performance is one from Xavier Leroy, who has a performance called Le Sacre du Printemps. So Xavier Leroy studied the conducting of Simon Rattle rehearsing the Le Sacre du Printemps, and he learned the movements. With both conductors, musicians could play together, but the musical interaction with Bernstein is more simple. And the quality of the movements is more elaborated in Xavier Leroy's performance. The same movements are approached from the musical and from the visual perspective. Gestures as visible utterance is a fundamental book from Camden that starts gesture research in a linguistic coordinate system. And there is some research that extends this territory into the music, but it's very, very at the beginning. Some consider even gestural research in the music already obsolete before it has started. I am a little bit of a different opinion. I think that the gesture research in music is important again. There is a prima pratica, seconda pratica situation in music where gestures have a second life and they need to be rediscovered. And the research into gestures facilitates that very, very strongly. Lehman wrote important thesis on this, defining the corporeal semantics of conducting, that can be seen and accepted and practiced as the modal translation of musical gestures and topoi. You see here the references to Hutton and Agau. Hutton is coming from a classical musicology angle and defines gestures as the change in density in whichever aspect we treat them. A change in density in terms of dynamics, in terms of sound characteristica, in terms of the density of the notes, so the speed, and in that way provides us a very important tool in gestural research. Also, Mark Lehman's research into the philosophical foundations of gesture research and conducting movements is foundational, very much hoped to have continuation. We can come back to this theoretical foundation part later. It's a little bit drier, and I brought a couple more visually more evocative examples, so I will just speed up there. To my first and very favorite example, Dieter Schnebel's Nostalgie for a solo conductor. One of the pieces that explores one side of conducting, and I'm defining conducting as a sum of two components, normative and qualitative function. Normative is responsible for the coordination of whatever needs to be done in a practical music setting. Qualitative function is responsible for the added value and the quality of musical and other happenings during the performance. And Schnebel explicitly focuses this piece on the qualitative component of conducting, which means there is no timely component, no musically timely component. It is a theater play piece for a conductor, notated in a way that is a mixture between musical and theatric notation. We see on the left side that the order of the movements is notated with letters. All the movements are denoted with commentary, with pictograms, with arrows, and there is also a small Roman numbering of the movements that says within that C setting, for instance, which is the order of the execution. It would be also possible to notate this theater piece in a musical score by simply 1, 2, 3, 4 in a 4/4 bar, and attaching to those notes different musical characters that would imply such conducting movements. But Schnebel, as experimenting as he is, or he has been, he chooses to go another way, and so he opens a graphical notation tradition for conductors that continues until today. Let me show you one of the iterations of this piece. We see now the beginning of that composition. So of course, the performance has a very strong comical and caricaturistic element, which is a sign that Schnabel was very much aware what the audience would need from a theatrical performance. So there is an immediate benefit for those who are in for the short ride, but there is a long range benefit of it, and this is the experience of link between the beautifully calligraphically elaborated notation and the potential of these movements to be elaborated similarly beautifully in the practice. That has a long way to go, and there are subsequent steps that actually pave the ways. So I foresee historic performance of the Dieter Schnabel Nostalgie in sometimes 20 to 30 years, when someone with classically trained dance background would beautifully design each and every movement of that. That would be a historical performance. I won't play it now, but Mauricio Kagel has a solo that is similarly exposing the conductor's figure in a theatric way. These are the firsts. They are the first who dare to do that. As set up before, I considered conducting to have two functions, a normative and a qualitative function. It's not for left and right, although the classical conducting school will teach it so, and this is also a very possible way of those functions to manifest. In a good conductor's hand, the lower 1/3 is the normative function and the upper 2/3 are for the qualitative function, which means that whatever the conductor does at the bottom of the beat, that will be the functional component. That is what musicians will rely on in terms of synchronicity. If we look at the student conductor who start to conduct, especially in a pedagogical setting, because they must for some reason, we will normally see a normative conducting that is capable of coordinating a group of musicians. And the more experienced and the more inspired the conducting gets, the more it will be filled with the qualitative function. They are superimposed. So the way in speech, the co-articulation of the semantic content, so the meaning is underlined with the movement, the same way is superimposed qualitative and functional and normative function in conducting. Conducting gestures act as a transmodal interpreters between coded gesture, played gesture, and perceived gesture. So they fulfill a sort of translating function visually and also historically. So they interpret between the rigid printed system and potential of a structure and the musicians. This is one framework, and the other framework is they interpret for those who are perceiving the performance. Molière, Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, has a similar, and so Lully has an accompaniment music for this topic, and we see that in the movie Tous les matins du monde. Apologies, I'm jumping a little bit to jump to the point. So in this movie, we see the traditional role of a conductor staged quite historically and quite authentically. Now the picture will be slightly out of sync, but we see how Lully might have conducted a piece. And if we look at a performance that follows the same guidelines, but it translates to today, we see François Saviero with Les Siècles Orchestra at BBC Proms, and he uses the same conducting attitude, but here we are missing something. We jump 200 years, and we expect more from the conductor. We expect that there is more qualitative component, qualitative function. So in this case, this is an almost post-naive and theatric performance. I will skip the introduction of this so that we see the conductor using a similar stick. This is how it starts. And I will jump to the end of this so that we see how it unfolds, all this ceremony. Gestures are canned. I consider the musical notation a sort of canning, like we would put fish in cans, and we would be able to open and cook with them some 10, 20 years ago, if if we are lucky. This uncanning of musical structure is infusing them with up-to-date contemporary gestural content. In other words, the canned Johann Sebastian set of black dots in a musical notation can be infused with a couple of gestural contents. The more we research, the more we refine the pool of possibilities. But the modal translation and the transduction will enable us to do that in a way that it relates to similar processes outside of music and then relate to other forms of performing arts. The coding and decoding would look like this in the proportion, in the coordinate system of time. So there is a core gesture that the composer is inspired by. There comes the process of compositional coding, which is the composition. Then there is time where the musical text is put to sleep for 0 to several hundred years. And then comes the decoding or unfolding of the musical text. And that is now the last bit, the moment that I'm interested in, where we assign or reassign gestures and topoi to that musical text. In terms of conducting, this includes various sets of normative and qualitative functions, and it results in a creation of music, period. I will come back to the question of prima pratica and seconda pratica. Seconda pratica for me in conducting means that the conducting is already responsible with this reinfusing of the musical text with up-to-date gestures. I think that this is happening after 100 years. So there is more or less a 90 to 100 years window that is for a composition to count as alive, where the performance tradition of that composition is still in the air. There are still relatives of those who perform those pieces who can transmit or transfer some original knowledge about the whys and hows that have been relating to the time of the origin. After that, everything is from scratch. One has to reinvent the piece, and one has to find out why does it make sense to do it today? And in that moment, the qualitative component of the conducting is asked for. And there are composers who will be interested only in that qualitative component of the conducting without the temporal aspect whatsoever. We will talk about the modal splitter, and there will be a little bit of remark about the sequence of densities introduced by Hutton. But first, I want to show you a couple of notations that are relating to conducting compositions alone. Here is a composition from my good friend Samuel Grillus. We presented a piece from him when we were at the Academy in Vienna, Chef d'oeuvre inconnu. He notates 3 theatric characters with text and rhythm and dynamic, sometimes visual notation. And he asked the conductors to perform this piece. I am very sorry. I'm just checking the chat window and I see that there has been a time warning. I'm very sorry about that. My last slide that I want to close with is an example of sound painting, yet another genre that uses conducting in an extended notion. Sound painting is a vocabulary of 1300 signs that are grammatically linked to each other. And while they are conducting, they transmit also content. So through sound painting science, we can tell performers what to do, how long to do, which notes to use, and which processes to employ to relate to each other. Here is an example with the Ensemble Amalgam conducted by Christophe Mangou. Two other employments of this technique of extended notation is Stockhausen's Inori that I'm now working on, and probably I'm dabbling a little bit in Winnie's territory. Stockhausen's Inori is notated for one or more mimes and orchestra with conductor. The two mimes are situated on the top of the stage, as we see here. It can be one or more of them, and their part is notated in a very precise way, and they have to appear like they would lead the orchestra instead of the conductor. So Stockhausen actually uses a notation for conductors that is absolutely kinetic, absolutely movement oriented, but it is rhythmically organized. And the last employment that is the newest also, Schubert's Serious Smile, where the conductor's hand has some electronic sensors on it, and it triggers electronic changes, it triggers sounds, and actually it makes fun of the conductor. The conductor has to go crazy, has to move spasmic, and everything that questions the authority of a conductor. It is one of my favorite pieces in these years, as the power position of a conductor is overdue for reholding, and this piece just triggers that. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very sorry if I caused a little bit of a time trouble. Here is my email address where you can reach me if you have any other question. I'm very interested in further leading conversations. And if we have time for now, I am glad to hear if you have any questions.